Hey everybody, it's Paul. I'm doing a tech talk today on wedges and specifically on gapping and how to make sure that you are gapped properly and recognizing that the letter on the club doesn't mean anything, it's what the loft is. Stay tuned. So before we go any farther, folks, please feel free to hit the subscribe button, the like button, and feel free to leave a comment or share. So when we're talking wedges, what I would like to do is go back in time and give you a little bit of history of where wedges have evolved and why we need to pay attention to the loft and not what's on the bottom of the club as far as a letter. So even since I've started playing golf, say 30, 35 years or more ago, we've had an evolution of wedges. So up through the 1980s, pitching wedge was always standard at about 48 degrees, and then the sand wedge was 56 degrees. And that was pretty well your options. You had pitching wedge and then you had sand wedge. And then in the 1990s sometime, a 52 degree gap wedge started to show up and became fairly popular. And they were introduced in order to bridge the 8-degree gap between the pitching wedge and the sand wedge. Because traditionally your irons have a 4 to 5 degree gap all the way through. And then we ended up with 8 degrees between pitching wedge and sand wedge. So gap wedge was created. However, today, many of the pitching wedges are 41 and 42 degrees, while the sand wedge stayed at 56. So now, in order to bridge that gap between a 41 or 42 and a 56, we need to add in several wedges in order to keep that 4-degree loft. So we would add in, say, a 46 degree and a 52 degree, keeping a nice gap there somewhere so that we're not bridging out into 2 and 3 clubs missing. So now I want to look at a couple of different scenarios and explain that when you change your irons or you change your wedges, you cannot just replace them with what you had because your iron set may have evolved and your wedge set may have evolved and the gapping may not be consistent anymore. So here's 3 different sets to look at. Set number 1 would have your traditional pitching wedge from past era. This is 1980s and prior. Pitching wedge of 48 degrees. And then a gap wedge was introduced somewhere along the line of 52 degrees. And you would have a sand wedge at 56, a lob wedge of 60. And then set number 2 is a little bit more modern. And your pitching wedge now dropped back and some of them ended up at 45, 46 degrees. And then they introduced an A wedge. So an A wedge would bring you up into 50. And then you'd have, keeping your gapping going, a gap wedge and a lob wedge. And now you can start to see that a gap wedge from one era is not necessarily the same as a gap wedge from another era. They may not even be the same from company to company. Set number 3 is more of a modern set, and it has a 41 degree pitching wedge. They would tend to introduce an A wedge into a 46 degree, and then a gap wedge into a 51 degree. That brings you up through your sand wedge and your lob wedge. So this is where it gets a little more technical. So now we're going to look at a scenario of what happens if I replaced a set of irons from one year with a set of irons in another year and left the wedges alone and didn't follow a gapping procedure with the wedges. So let's say we have that old set, traditional 48 degree pitching wedge from years gone by. And I've got a modern gap wedge, sand wedge, and lob wedge. So we have a gap wedge at 52, sand wedge at 56, and a lob wedge at 60. And then we decide we're going to change irons and go with something a little bit more modern. And we don't go completely modern, we go kind of moderately modern. Still an older set of clubs, but much newer than the old set. So now we end up with a pitching wedge of 46 degrees. Now, if I brought and kept all my wedges from the left column in the red and brought those over to flow, then I go from 46 degrees to 52, and I have a 6-degree gap rather than a 4. So now I have a half a club difference missing between my gapping. So now I'm starting to create holes in my set. Now if I keep going further down the line and I keep my old set and I compare that to, say, I'm going to upgrade into something very modern and current now, and I throw my irons away, I buy new irons, but I bring my wedges over from the left-hand column over to the right-hand side, and now I've got a 41 degree pitching wedge and a 52 degree gap wedge. So now I have an 11 degree gap, which is more than 2 clubs. So I would have a 2 club hole in my set somewhere because I just brought my wedges over and didn't flow them into the gap. So you can see that just bringing wedges over and saying, well, I have a gap wedge, I don't need a different gap wedge. To begin with, what we need to understand is that one company may call the wedge immediately after their pitching wedge a gap wedge. Another company may call it an A wedge. So Callaway, for instance, has an A wedge that follows the pitching wedge, and then a gap wedge which follows the A wedge. With Cobra, the club that follows the pitching wedge is a gap wedge. So there are many different ways to do it. So if you're bringing over a set or changing out your wedges and you say, well, I had a gap wedge, and now I'll get another gap wedge, you may not even get the same loft. So it's so important that we buy wedges based on loft and not on what the letter is on the bottom, because a gap wedge could be anything from 46 degrees to 52 degrees depending on the company, or depending on where that company puts their gap wedge in their set, or whether they even have a gap wedge. So make sure that when you're buying wedges and you're changing out your irons, that there's a flow of 4 or 5 degrees all the way through everything. And when I do a fitting, I always provide a recommendation on wedges, even if the person wasn't asking for wedges. If they're in fitting for irons, I will provide a wedge recommendation that flows from where their irons will end up, because the lofts on those irons may be completely different than the ones you had from another set. Even if the two sets are current, there could be a huge difference between whether you're at a game improvement iron or whether you're playing more of kind of a traditional blade style iron. There will be a huge difference in the loft of the pitching wedge. So don't get stuck on thinking, I don't need another wedge, I've got a wedge already. It may not be the right one, and it may provide a gap where you now have a distance that is not achievable with a normal swing. So if you have any questions, give me a shout. I'm Paul Kelly. Thanks for watching.